The Warriors of Chaos are highly charismatic miniatures and can be painted in a huge variety of different ways. These figures can be commonly found in such games as Warhammer. I'm going to paint this warrior using 3rd generation acrylic paints from AK Interactive. Let's start with the black for the armour. This is a fundamental part of the model, so I need to pay special attention and make sure it stands out visually. I also need to spend time on some realistic lighting, so I'm going to apply a smooth colour gradient from the darker shade of the primer to a slightly warmer shade of grey. From a base coat in NATO black, I'll mix in a little light brown to create that gradient. I'm gradually adding light and highlights to the figure by adding a bit of sand yellow to the mix. With the brightest shade of this colour, I will highlight the ridges in each area. Let's move on to the leather of the boots, gloves and belt. I'm mixing the reddish brown RAL 8013 Rot Brown with dark sea blue to completely cover the surface of each element. To this I will gradually add some dark rust for some initial highlighting. I paint less and less of the surface each time I add light brown to the mix. Finally, with a little sand yellow, I add the final highlights. Now let's move on to the cape and decorative front cloth. This is a large area, so I'll make sure that the transitions are not too sudden for an eye-catching result. I'm going to create light coloured fabric that will contrast against the dark finish on the rest of this figure. I will first cover the entire surface with Desert Uniform base. I want to make sure I apply an even coat and that you cannot see the black coming through anywhere. I add light earth to the mix for highlighting the pleats catching the most light. Finally, I use a bit of ivory for the brightest areas. Next comes the hair. For this I will use burnt umber for a coat covering all the hair on the miniature. The highlighting needs to be done hair by hair, focusing on the upper sections which would be the brightest. Then I apply another coat with NATO brown, but reducing the surface size to be highlighted. Finally I add pastel green for the brightest areas. The cape seems to be made from some sort of bear because there is a huge paw hanging in the middle. I'm going to paint the palm of that paw in a pinkish colour. To do so, I start with a base coat of dark rust, followed by brown rose. The final highlights are simply added with a touch of ivory in the mix. The bones, for example the horns on the helmet or the claws on the bear paw, are painted with a base coat of chocolate. Then I mix in light earth to highlight the upper areas. Finally I add white to highlight the brightest parts. I want to add a touch of colour for the hair on the helmet. I will do this with a reddish colour. I start with hull red paint and add deep red to the mix for an intense shade. The final highlights in this area can be done by adding a little sand yellow to the mix. I will paint the tape around the grip in exactly the same way as I did the cape, only with a slightly more orangey colour. I'll use exactly the same colour recipe but starting from light brown. A nice detail can be added by painting the stones on the pendant in a turquoise colour, which would stand out quite a lot. For example, I'm using emerald and highlighting it bit by bit with pale yellow here. To finish the figure, I apply a base layer of gunmetal to all the metal parts, mixing in a little NATO black. The highlighting is done with just gunmetal, reducing the area to be painted and focusing on the brightest. I want to create some realistic natural looking shine on all the metal. Little by little I add aluminium to the mix until all the silver areas are done. Finally the belt buckle is painted with brass for a nice golden colour. And at this point my Warrior of Chaos is finished and ready for battle.